Atlanta continues to own the offensive glass here in the fourth quarter.
I don't even play basketball and I would have made that shot. And even if I didn't make that shot, I'd have did something funny. You know, I'd have did something funny. Came Clark was like, hey, let's all do this hoop code and hand point.
But just 35% from three after a couple years in the 40s. Howard misses that one.
Ryan Howard or Alicia Gray, I think Ryan Howard, airballs a shot to win the game late. It lands in Angel Reese's lap, and collectively the whole world said, yeah, she ain't making that. Collectively, the whole world said, oh, Angel Reese has it? Oh, and it's a layup? Yeah, she's breaking that. And lo and behold, point blank range to win the game, we get a classic Angel Reese pray up and a...
Angel Reese just went ballistic after Caitlin Clark laughed in her face following a missed game-winning layup, and the basketball world is processing what happened as the most personally concentrated and the most emotionally intense single competitive moment the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced across 2 full seasons of professional competition. Because the specific combination of the missed game-winning layup, the laughter, and the ballistic reaction creates a competitive and emotional tableau that reveals more about the specific nature of the Clark and Reese relationship at its most unfiltered and its most competitively honest level than any institutional analysis of their commercial competition or their governance accountability positioning has been able to surface from the managed professional surface that both players typically present in their most carefully controlled public communications. Today I am breaking down exactly what happened in the specific competitive moment when Clark laughed in Reese's face after the missed game-winning layup, why the laughter is the analytically significant element of the story, rather than simply the most dramatically visible element, what Reese going ballistic reveals about the specific emotional and competitive investment she has in the Clark relationship, that her most carefully managed professional communications have been most consistently obscuring, and what the entire sequence from the missed layup, through the laugh, through the ballistic reaction, tells you about where the Clark and Reese competitive dynamic is in its most unfiltered and its most emotionally honest single competitive expression. And stay with me, because at the 10-minute mark I am going to show you the specific competitive and psychological dimension of the Clark laugh that the mainstream coverage is treating as the most provocative element of the story, when it is actually the most analytically revealing element, and the one that changes how the entire Clark and Reese competitive dynamic needs to be understood in its most psychologically honest and its most competitively complete form. The Clark and Reese dynamic has been the most publicly documented and the most commercially discussed competitive relationship in women's basketball across 2 full seasons of professional competition. And the arc of that relationship across the Clark era's most dramatic governance accountability season has produced a series of increasingly concentrated and increasingly emotionally revealing competitive and institutional expressions that the previous videos in this series have documented and analyzed in their most complete institutional and commercial dimensions. The Player of the Week tantrum, the All-Star MVP robbery, the Aja Wilson losing it after the All-Star captain designation. All of those things have been building the institutional and emotional context within which the missed game-winning layup, the Clark laugh, and the Reese going ballistic have now arrived as the most unfiltered and the most emotionally intense single competitive expression the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced across the entire arc of the most dramatically concentrated single competitive relationship the Clark era has built. The specific emotional intensity of the ballistic reaction to the Clark laugh is not the product of this single competitive moment alone. It is the culmination of the accumulated competitive and emotional investment the entire arc of the Clark and Reese dynamic has been building toward the specific competitive moment in which the most unfiltered and the most emotionally honest single expression of that dynamic has arrived in its most personally concentrated and its most publicly documented form. Let us start with the missed game-winning layup, because the specific competitive context of the missed shot is the analytical foundation of everything that follows, and the mainstream coverage has been treating the Clark laugh and the Reese going ballistic as the primary story without adequately examining the specific competitive significance of the missed. Game-winning layup and why the specific competitive context the missed shot creates is the foundational element that makes the laugh and the ballistic reaction the analytically significant competitive expressions they are. In the most honest and the most complete account of what happened in the most emotionally intense, single competitive moment the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced. A missed game-winning layup in professional basketball is the specific competitive moment of maximum individual competitive pressure and maximum individual competitive exposure. The moment when the player attempting the shot is in the most individually exposed competitive position the game can create, with the full weight of the team's competitive success depending on the individual competitive execution of a single offensive action that the player has had thousands of opportunities to practice and that the professional basketball context demands be converted at the highest available percentage against whatever defensive resistance the competitive moment provides. Reese missing the specific game-winning layup in the specific competitive context the shot occurred in is the most individually exposed competitive failure the specific game provided, and the specific competitive exposure the miss creates is the emotional and competitive context within which the Clark laugh arrives as the most immediately and the most personally concentrated competitive communication available in the moment the missed layup creates. Understanding the missed layup as the competitive context rather than simply the setup for the laugh is the analytical work that produces the most complete account of why the Clark laugh lands with the emotional and competitive weight that made Reese going ballistic the most personally intense competitive reaction the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced. Now let us talk about the Clark laugh specifically, because the laughter is the most analytically significant element of the entire story, and the mainstream coverage is treating it primarily as the provocative action that triggered the ballistic reaction when it is actually the most psychologically and the most competitively revealing communication the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced in its most unfiltered and its most emotionally honest single competitive expression. The Clark laugh in the immediate aftermath of the Reese missed game-winning layup is not the standard competitive celebration that professional athletes deploy in moments of competitive success, the fist pump or the verbal exclamation or the teammate embrace that the most standard competitive celebration vocabulary most naturally produces. It is a specific and directed communication to the specific individual whose competitive failure in the most individually exposed competitive moment the game provided has produced the competitive advantage the laugh most specifically acknowledges and most personally celebrates in the most concentrated and the most individually directed form the competitive moment makes available. The directionality of the laugh, the specific targeting of the communication at Reese as the individual whose missed layup has created the specific competitive advantage the laugh acknowledges, is the element that distinguishes the Clark laugh from standard competitive celebration and makes it the most psychologically and the most competitively revealing single competitive communication the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced in its most unfiltered and its most emotionally honest form. That directionality is the element that makes Reese going ballistic the most naturally proportionate emotional and competitive response available in the specific competitive and psychological context the directed laugh creates, because the directed laugh is experienced not as the celebration of a competitive outcome, but as the most personally concentrated competitive communication to the specific individual at the center of the most individually exposed competitive failure the moment has produced. Now let us talk about the psychological dimension of the Clark laugh, because this is the analytically significant layer that the mainstream coverage is treating as the dramatic, provocative surface of a competitive confrontation story, when it is actually the most psychologically revealing element of the entire Clark and Reese dynamic, and the one that changes how the competitive relationship needs to be understood in its most psychologically honest and its most competitively complete form. The Clark laugh in the face of Reese's missed game-winning layup is not simply the expression of competitive satisfaction at a rival's critical failure in the most individually exposed competitive moment the game provided. It is the specific psychological communication of a competitor who has internalized the Clark and Reese competitive dynamic in the most competitively confident and the most psychologically dominant form that the directed competitive communication of laughter in the face of a rival's most individually exposed failure can express in the most unfiltered competitive moment the professional basketball context provides. Clark's willingness to laugh directly at Reese in the most personally concentrated competitive communication the moment makes available reveals something specific about how she is experiencing the Clark and Reese competitive dynamic at the most psychologically unfiltered level of her competitive identity. And that revelation is the most psychologically honest and the most competitively complete single indicator of the Clark and Reese competitive dynamic's current psychological state, that the most unfiltered competitive moment the Clark era's most dramatically concentrated competitive relationship has produced. The psychological confidence the directed laugh communicates is the specific element that makes it more analytically significant than the standard provocative competitive communication the mainstream coverage most naturally treats it as. Because the psychological confidence of laughing directly at a rival in the most individually exposed competitive failure moment reveals the specific level of competitive psychological dominance that the entire arc of the Clark and Reese dynamic has been building toward in its most psychologically honest and its most competitively concentrated single expression. Now let us talk about Reese going ballistic, because the specific nature of the ballistic reaction is the most emotionally honest and the most personally revealing single competitive expression the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced. And understanding what the ballistic reaction reveals about Reese's specific emotional and competitive investment in the Clark relationship requires engaging with the psychological dimension of the reaction rather than simply the dramatic surface of the most intense competitive emotional expression the Clark and Reese dynamic has generated. Reese going ballistic after Clark laughed in her face following the missed game-winning layup is not simply the standard emotional reaction of a competitor who has been provoked in the most personally concentrated form available in the specific competitive moment. It is the specific emotional expression of a competitor whose investment in the Clark competitive relationship has reached the specific emotional threshold at which the most personally concentrated competitive provocation, the directed laugh in the face of the most individually exposed competitive failure, produces the most emotionally intense and the most competitively revealing single competitive reaction the investment can generate in its most unfiltered and its most emotionally honest form. The ballistic quality of the reaction is the analytical indicator of the specific emotional investment depth the Clark and Reese competitive relationship has created in Reese's competitive psychology. Because ballistic reactions in professional competitive contexts are produced by the specific combination of emotional investment depth and competitive provocation intensity that the Clark laugh in the face of the missed game-winning layup most specifically creates at the most personally concentrated single competitive moment the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced across 2 full seasons of professional competition. Understanding the ballistic reaction in those terms, rather than simply as the dramatic emotional expression of competitive frustration, is the analytical work that produces the most emotionally honest and the most competitively complete account of what the Clark laugh and the Reese going ballistic together reveal about the specific psychological state of the most competitively invested and the most emotionally concentrated competitive relationship the Clark era has built. Now let us zoom all the way out, because the missed game-winning layup, the Clark laugh, and Reese going ballistic together represent the most unfiltered and the most emotionally honest single competitive moment the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced across 2 full seasons of professional competition. And understanding what the sequence reveals about the competitive relationship requires examining both the specific psychological and competitive dimensions of each element and the broader competitive and emotional context the entire arc of the Clark and Reese dynamic has created as the foundation within which the most personally concentrated and the most emotionally intense single competitive expression the relationship has produced needs to be most completely understood. The entire arc of the Clark and Reese dynamic across the Clark era's most dramatic governance accountability season has been building the emotional and competitive investment that makes the ballistic reaction the most proportionate available expression of the accumulated emotional and competitive weight the relationship has produced. And the specific competitive moment of the missed game-winning layup, the Clark laugh, and the ballistic reaction is the most concentrated single expression of that accumulated emotional and competitive weight in the most unfiltered and the most emotionally honest competitive form the dynamic has yet produced. The broader governance accountability story's most commercially and institutionally significant dimensions have shaped the context within which the most unfiltered competitive moment has arrived. But the competitive and psychological dimensions of the moment itself are the most emotionally honest and the most competitively revealing elements of the Clark and Reese story that the most carefully managed professional communications of both players have been most consistently and most carefully obscuring behind the institutional and commercial surface that the standard analytical framing of the Clark and Reese dynamic most naturally foregrounds. Remember the most analytically revealing element of the Clark laugh? Here it is. The specific psychological confidence the directed laugh communicates is the element that most specifically reveals the psychological state of the Clark and Reese competitive dynamic at its most unfiltered and its most emotionally honest level. Because the willingness to laugh directly at a rival in the most individually exposed competitive failure moment reveals the specific competitive psychological dominance that the entire arc of the Clark and Reese dynamic has been building toward in its most psychologically confident and its most competitively concentrated single expression. And understanding that psychological confidence dimension in its full competitive and emotional complexity is the analytical work that most completely reveals why Reese going ballistic is the most emotionally honest and the most personally revealing competitive reaction the specific directed laugh in the most individually exposed competitive failure moment could produce, from the competitor with the most emotionally and competitively invested relationship with the Clark competitive identity. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about the missed layup, the laugh, and the ballistic reaction, and why the sequence matters beyond the immediate drama of the most emotionally intense competitive confrontation the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced. The specific psychological communication the Clark laugh makes in the context of the missed game-winning layup is the most analytically significant competitive communication the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced in its most unfiltered form, because it establishes the specific competitive psychological state of the Clark and Reese dynamic at the most emotionally honest level that the standard managed professional communications of both players have been most consistently and most carefully obscuring. The competitive psychological state the directed laugh most specifically reveals is the state of a competitor who has internalized the Clark and Reese competitive dynamic in the most competitively confident form available at the most individually exposed competitive failure moment the specific game context has created. And the institutional significance of that revelation is what makes the Clark laugh the most analytically significant competitive communication rather than simply the most provocative competitive action, the most emotionally intense single competitive moment the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced. The second hidden angle is the specific effect of the most emotionally intense competitive confrontation on the Clark and Reese commercial dynamic, and the specific commercial implications of the most unfiltered competitive expression the dynamic has produced for every commercial entity whose investments in the Clark and Reese individual commercial ecosystems are most directly shaped by the competitive relationship the most emotionally concentrated single competitive moment has revealed in its most psychologically honest and its most competitively complete form. My verdict on the missed layup, the Clark laugh, and Reese going ballistic is this. Stated directly and with the psychological and competitive honesty the most emotionally intense single competitive moment the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced most urgently requires the analytical framework to engage with completely. Angel Reese going ballistic after Caitlin Clark laughed in her face following the missed game-winning layup is the most unfiltered and the most emotionally honest single competitive expression the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced across 2 full seasons of professional competition, because the specific combination of the most individually exposed competitive failure moment, the most psychologically confident directed competitive communication, and the most emotionally invested ballistic reaction together create the most concentrated and the most competitively revealing single expression of the Clark and Reese competitive relationship's most psychologically honest and its most emotionally complete competitive state. The first reason this verdict is correct is the psychological revelation dimension. The Clark laugh's directed psychological confidence in the most individually exposed competitive failure moment reveals the specific competitive psychological dominance the entire arc of the Clark and Reese dynamic has been building toward in its most psychologically honest and its most competitively concentrated single expression. And that psychological revelation is the most analytically significant competitive communication the dynamic has produced in its most unfiltered form. The second reason is the emotional investment revelation dimension. Reese going ballistic reveals the specific emotional investment depth the Clark competitive relationship has created in her competitive psychology in the most emotionally concentrated and the most personally revealing single competitive expression the dynamic has produced. And that emotional investment revelation is the most emotionally honest, single indicator of the Clark and Reese competitive relationship's psychological state that the most unfiltered competitive moment the dynamic has generated provides. The third reason is the competitive relationship revelation dimension. The sequence of the missed layup, the laugh, and the ballistic reaction together reveals the specific competitive and psychological state of the Clark and Reese dynamic at its most honest and its most complete level in the way that the most carefully managed professional communications of both players have been most consistently and most carefully obscuring. And that competitive relationship revelation is the most competitively complete single indicator of the Clark and Reese dynamic's current psychological state that the most unfiltered competitive moment the Clark era's most dramatically concentrated competitive relationship has produced. The strongest counterargument is that the Clark laugh, however psychologically revealing as the most competitively confident directed communication in the most individually exposed competitive failure moment, represents a competitive sportsmanship failure that the standard professional competitive conduct expectations should prevent regardless of the psychological insight the laugh most specifically reveals about the competitive dynamic's most honest state, and that the analytical framework's focus on the psychological revelation dimension of the laugh risks normalizing competitive conduct that falls below the professional sportsmanship standards the competitive environment most appropriately demands. That argument has genuine merit as a sportsmanship standards concern. The counter to the counter is that the analytical significance of the Clark laugh as the most psychologically revealing competitive communication the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced in its most unfiltered form is not incompatible with the sportsmanship standards evaluation the argument most specifically requires. And engaging honestly with both the psychological revelation dimension and the sportsmanship standards dimension simultaneously is the analytical work that produces the most complete and the most honest account of what the missed layup, the laugh, and the ballistic reaction together reveal about the Clark and Reese competitive dynamic in its most emotionally honest and its most competitively complete single expression. So tell me in the comments right now, does the Clark laugh after Reese's missed game-winning layup represent the most psychologically revealing competitive communication the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced in its most unfiltered form? And does Reese going ballistic represent the most emotionally honest and the most personally revealing competitive reaction the directed laugh in the most individually exposed competitive failure moment could produce from the competitor with the most emotionally and competitively invested relationship with the Clark competitive identity? Drop your answer, because this is the competitive and psychological question, the most emotionally intense single competitive moment the Clark and Reese dynamic has produced, most specifically requires the most honest and the most complete analytical engagement.